Well, welcome and thank you for watching. We're continuing our endeavor to learn the London system, and we are utilizing the chess.com bots in order to practice and become more familiar not only with the structure of the London, but also the strategies and the tactics. Our game today is our second game with Mina 700, working our way up the chess.com bot rating ladder. And so let's begin. The London opens with d4. Mina responds with e6. We'll bring our second move out, which is the bishop to f4. And similar to the first game, Mina quickly brings out the queen to h4. Now, once again, let us not get mesmerized by this potential assault and miss this capture right here. Fortunately, the third move of the London is e3, protecting both the bishop and the pawn. You should be familiar with this now because we've encountered this several times with some of the other bots as well. Mina responds with knight to f6. Now, the reason for this, if you will look at where this knight can go afterwards in the second move, coming and targeting this square from either the g4 or e4 square, putting the queen right here with protection, so a quick checkmate. But we're not going to let that happen. The fourth move in the London for us today is knight to f3, putting pressure on the queen for capture. And Mina responds by bringing the bishop down to b4, putting the king in check. Once again, we've been through this scenario. We can take the b knight and move to d2, or we can simply move the c2 pawn to c3, which is my preference because it immediately puts pressure on the bishop of capture. So we have two of black's pieces that are in jeopardy here, and Mina's going to have to decide which one she's willing to sacrifice. And so she moves the queen over to g4. Now, before we just quickly take this bishop, let's at least give thought to what we have here. But we are protected should the queen decide to come down and seek to capture the g2 pawn. The f1 bishop would take. So we are clear to capture the bishop. Mina responds by bringing a threat to our dark square bishop at f4. Now, let's look at some possible scenarios of what we can do for escape. First of all, and obvious, we can move back to g3. This kind of blocks the queen from coming this way. It would give us an opportunity to move the light squared bishop out along its diagonal, which is part of the London system, moving the light square bishop out to d3. So we could do that, move the bishop back. We could also move to the e5 square, putting pressure upon the knight. Should the knight move, we then have pressure upon the rook in the corner at h8. But there is also another move that we've seen before, and that is to come on down to the c7 pawn and capture it because it is an unprotected pawn. So that is the choice that I made at the time. We go down, capture. The king moves up to e2, and now we have some other issues here that we probably need to at least address. And again, that is the queen. That's the 800-pound gorilla in the living room right there that I really am uncomfortable with being at the fourth rank. So let's see if we can move that queen out of this region here by moving our h-pawn up to h3, thereby targeting the queen. And the queen decides to move back to h5. And once again, as we saw in a previous game, we have an interesting opportunity for the light squared bishop to move to e2 and kind of have a pin here on the queen. With this knight in between, and we will find a place for that knight to move. So let's take advantage of that. We've done this before. This should be a familiar scenario to you. Mina chooses to move to b6, and now we just need to really find a square for our knight to move to that would be safe and possibly advantageous. Again, we are in the octagon of influence, and we just need to begin to see which ones are available. Well, obviously, this is not available. This would not probably be a wise move, though being safe, it's not really moving our knight into a better attacking position. Moving here, of course, it's occupied. Moving back to this square, certainly, or this one is not an option for us. It really, again, is not pushing our knight into an attacking position. Here is just a capture. Here is another capture by the queen. So we really only have one space, and that is the e5 square here. And that's okay, because that is one of those favorite places that we like to put our knight on, because of the influence that the knight has in the center of the board. So let's go ahead and do that. Mina responds by moving the queen back to this to try and target this, and obviously to bring this knight to one of these squares to add and lend support. So we'll just continue with our development, bringing the B knight to D2. Mina responds by bringing the rook over to G7, or G8, I should say, and targeting possibly this G file and gaining control of it, something that we need to be mindful of as the game progresses. We'll just go ahead and, again, try to move this queen out of this region. Again, I'm still not comfortable with it. Move the pawn to G3, putting pressure on the queen. And the Mina chooses to bring the knight down to G4 and hangs the queen. And we've seen this before with Mina and with Aaron both, sometimes hanging the queen. So easy will take. Mina takes the knight at E5. We will respond by bringing our bishop back, being protected now by the pawn and in the center of the board. And now we're just in a very good position, having captured the queen. Mina responds with D6. So again, we just need to find a safe square for the bishop to come back and be protected. And once again, I want to keep eyes on this F2 square here, just in case this rook decides to come up and target this. So we'll move to the G3 square. We have a pawn capture here with some pressure on our bishop. But again, this is really not a threat. We just take, and instantly we will have check on the king. Hopefully you saw that in the process. King is in check, moves back to F8. And now I'm actually going to have you pause the video and look for some better moves than the one that I made. I kind of became, mesmerized by this potential of this rook moving down and disrupting things. And so I thought, well, it'd probably be a good idea to move my dark square bishop back to G3. It's protected. I can kind of block any of this movement along this file for the rook that would approach my king in some way. But I actually missed some really good alternative moves. So pause the video, see if you can come up with a few. I think I identified at least 4 that I thought were much better moves. Go ahead and pause the video and see what you find. All right. So what I see here is first of all, for this bishop to move to F3, and once again, we have the target here, and there's just not going to be much of an escape here for the rook. There can be a block of the knight, but we would, if we're here with the bishop, we would just take and we'd capture that free of charge. So that's a good move. Another one would be to move the knight up to E4 and then eventually to D6, being at this square. And we've seen how valuable the rook, or I should say the knight at D6 is, how many squares that it controls being toward the center of the board. We also have a wonderful move of this open file with the C file with the queen moving to C2, or moving the rook over to c1 and also controlling this file. So all of these were probably better moves than this one here that I made, mainly because there's really no threat from this rook, and I just didn't look at it enough. But nonetheless, that's the play, and we'll continue on. So now this gives Mina an opportunity to move her light squared bishop out and target my rook. So we'll just sidestep this very simply. Now let's be mindful of something, and that is if I do inadvertently move this bishop somewhere, Mina will have the opportunity to come down and capture my rook free of charge and put my king in check. So let's just kind of remember that. Again, I think I gave you the suggestion in one of the earlier videos of keeping a pad and pencil on the side and mark some of these things, like just a reminder, keep dark squared bishop at g3. And you can kind of refer to your notes during the game just to make sure you don't make some kind of blunder like that. So the king moves over to e8, and we're going to take advantage of moving the queen along the light square diagonal to a4, putting the king in check. And Mina responds with moving the bishop to c6. This is not a response. This is going to end up in an easy capture. We'll move the pawn up first, and Mina chooses to move the h-pawn up to h5, and of course we will just capture. King moves up to e7, and now we can just begin, I hope you saw this, just begin to push our pawn toward the back rank and possibly get another piece, and that's what I did. Of course, the knight needs to move at this point and moves to the wrong square. Actually, this would have been the better square right here, because then you'd have the protection of the king. But Mina chooses to move to the c6 square. This is an easy capture. Now my queen is on the 6th rank, getting ready to move to the 7th rank. And we really are surrounding the king. And so Mina responds by taking the bishop at g3. Again, this is just an easy capture of the rook and exchange of the bishop for the rook, which we always want to do. And now the rook goes over to h8. Now, there is a tactic that I have learned, several tactics I've learned from the bots. And this was another one. I've shared some of the others before with you. And the tactic is to try and entice a movement of your opponent to make a capture. So you're making a willing sacrifice here, moving the bishop here, just saying, yeah, go ahead and take me. It's an easy take free of charge. But what happens is, and I've been the victim of this as the bots have played it against me, I've inadvertently done that move where I move the rook up to take a piece, forgetting that I now have no protection along the back rank for the advancement of this pawn here. And usually the game ends very quickly because of that. So I've learned that tactic and chose to employ it this time. We have this light squared bishop here that could take and entice this rook to come down, and we're willing to sacrifice this bishop in order to gain possibly and more likely another queen. But Mina sees through that and says no, advances her d-pawn to d5, and now we can move the rook over to f1 and begin to secure this rank here, or I should say this file right here, so that the king cannot escape this way. And again, we are beginning to surround the king even more, and we're really just a few moves away from checkmate. Mina does really the only thing that she can to avoid checkmate in one move, and I'll show you that. Move my rook over to f1. Now, if she made some other move, we would just very simply be able to move the rook there, having protection from the bishop, and there is now no escape. The rook would cover that square, this square, And of course, the queen covers these squares and the pawn this one. So that would have been checkmate. So Mina did the only thing that she could in order to avoid that, and that is to move the pawn up to f6. But now we have an opportunity to move the queen along the same rank as the king, kind of pinning our pawn to this king. And again, this is one of those moves that the bots taught me. And that is in the very next move of white. Once we move the pawn to the back rank and get another queen, what we have also done is put the king in check. So that prohibits the rook from coming over and taking this advanced pawn, being a queen now. And because the king now has to move out of check or protect in some way. So this is the tactic that we're using here by moving the queen over on the same rank and pinning our own piece, in this case this pawn at c7, in order to move that in and get our queen. And of course the king, if this did occur, the king would probably have to move to, this square, and then we would have a queen here and could easily go over and capture the rook if we wanted to. So wonderful tactic, and again, something I've been burned by the chess.com bots in the past, but fortunately I can learn from those things. The rook comes over. This is not a threat in any way. We just take with the queen. And the movement of the king now is just very limited, and there's really not much that can be done. So Mina chooses to move the e-pawn up to e5, and now we're in a wonderful position to put the king in check by simply moving the queen over to d8. And now if we kind of pause for a moment and see the dilemma that this king is in, we'll see there's really no escape. We have the rook here, we have the square here guarded by the bishop. All of these are taken up by the queen. And the king is going to move to the one square that it can, but again, there's no escape here for the king. All of these squares are taken and defended, and now all we have to do is put the king in check, and hopefully you see the one move that can make that available. And that is to move the pawn to the back rank, and we get a queen, and obviously we're now in check, and that is checkmate. So this is a 30-move game, and once again, against Mina 700, and I hope you learn some more tactics to be utilized, some things that I've learned from the bots that you can learn as well. And we hope to see you in the next game. We're moving on to Zara 850 as we're working our way up the chess.com bot ratings ladder. So Zara 850 is our next video. Again, thank you for watching. Look forward to seeing you in our next endeavor of learning more about the London.